welcome to the Stewardship Network's monthly webcast. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I will be your host for today. Just going to wait a little bit here to let some folks join in. Seeing some folks already joining. Hello, Autumn and Brenda and Cameron and Katie and Judy. And now, as there are many more names joining, I won't be able to say everybody, but just really appreciate everybody hopping back on. Welcome back, Rachel, one of our staff members recently coming back to us from a wonderful vacation. Lizzie, welcome. Just give it another couple seconds here. And thank you again to Bob Zamet, who is on the back end, making sure everything is running smoothly. Always appreciate that. And I think with that, maybe we will just get started and we'll let folks trickle in as they come. So thank you once again. My name is Rob Luzinski, and I am the community coordinator with the Stewardship Network. And I am happy to be your host today for our October 2023 monthly webcast. A little bit about us. TSN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with an award-winning 20-year history. We are now serving 20 plus place-based member communities from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Ocean. And our free TSN webcasts happen on the second Wednesday of every month in the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour. Our mission is to connect, equip, and mobilize people and organizations to care for land and water in their communities. So ways that we mobilize folks is through our TSN member communities, and we make collaborative ecological stewardship accessible to all. We equip our TSN member communities so they can pour thousands of annual work hours into their ecosystems. And we connect the member communities and their specialized knowledge that they've collected, and we share it as widely as possible, both within those member communities and outside of them. And one great example of a recent initiative where we were connecting knowledge with folks is through our California Landscape Stewardship Network. California's 30 by 30 partnership gathering begins today. So we want to congratulate the 30 by 30 initiative, the California Natural Resources Agency, and all of the amazing people and organizations that are a part of this initiative. We're really excited to see 30 by 30 catching on in other states as well. And so be on the lookout for new initiatives coming to a city or state near you. And of course, we would need to mention the connection that happens at our annual conference. So the Stewardship Network Conference 2024 is happening January 29th and 30th of next year. And we are so very excited to be back in person. It's one of my personal favorite things about working at the Stewardship Network is meeting with folks that we don't get a chance to connect with all the time, and seeing the faces of people of the network, people that you know, people that you don't know. It's just a wonderful manifestation of everything that the network is. And so we encourage you to learn more at stewardshipnetwork.org/conference. And you can register, and we'll have some information about our speakers coming up soon and all of the above to get you excited. One such bit of information is that Priya Nanjapa, the Vice President of Conservation Programs at the National Parks Conservation Association, and Evan Larson, Professor of Environmental Sciences and Society at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, are our two keynote speakers this year. We are so very excited to have them, and we think that you will love all of the information and insights and experiences that they'll be bringing to the table. And not only will we have them, but we'll have a ton of other speakers as well. So we encourage you to keep a lookout for that. Early bird registration is now through November. So we recommend that you register as soon as possible to save money with our best prices. You can get ahead of it on your calendar, and you can also help us prepare to know how many people to expect. So once again, stewardshipnetwork.org/conference. Please feel free to learn more and to register today. We also encourage you to submit your poster abstract if you'd like to be a part of the conference. It's a beloved tradition that we're bringing back for the in-person conference. Your poster will be displayed throughout the event, and you will have dedicated time to present your poster to folks that will be wandering and exploring all of the great posters we have to offer during one of our evening sessions. And so we're really excited to provide this opportunity again, and we encourage you to visit our website to submit your poster abstract today. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our speakers for the webcast today. We have Nick Sanchez, Network Manager of the Old Growth Forest Network, and Sarah Adloo, Executive Director of the Old Growth Forest Network. And today they will be presenting creating a network of old growth forests in Michigan. So with that, I would like to invite our speakers to join and steal the screen share from me. And I encourage folks to use the Q&A feature throughout the presentation to collect your questions. I'll make sure to keep an eye on those for the Q&A section at the end. And feel free to share any insights or thoughts or resources that you might have via the chat throughout the presentation. And with that, take it away.
Okay, hello everyone. Very happy to be talking with you all today alongside Nick Sanchez here. We are both coming from the Old Growth Forest Network, and we would love to talk to you about old growth forests and especially about how we can promote a canopy of older and old growth forests throughout the United States and specifically Michigan. So I'm talking to you from the southeastern United States, but our network manager, Nick Sanchez, will be able to talk to you more specifically about Michigan since he has spent a long time there and knows those forests well. So to start us off, I'll give you a little more of an introduction. I'm the executive director with the Old Growth Forest Network. And you can see me there in a picture with our founder, Dr. Joan Maloof, who is a writer of many books about forests and old growth forests. I encourage you to check out. They're lovely and wonderful. And we are, in that picture, we are with a bold cypress tree in the Congaree National Park, a magnificent, giant old growth forest of the southeastern United States. So first, I'm going to do a quick introduction into old growth forest ecosystems and the dynamics of forests that give us old growth forests. This is a concept that not everyone is familiar with, and we have unfortunately eliminated a lot of these forests across our landscape. And so there's this process that we need to go through to introduce people back into what they might be able to see in an old growth forest and how we can get to that point. So the idea of old growth forests is one that is not extremely concrete. There's multiple definitions and lenses that you can take to understand when a forest enters this old growth stage. While in this past year, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management have been creating a set of definitions around old growth forests to help them inventory what's actually across our forests on National Forest land and Bureau of Land Management land. Before that, there have not been many definitions out there that kind of apply to the entire country. So they created almost 200 forest community specific definitions around old growth forests. I'm going to talk to you about some of the more centralized ones that will apply to a lot of our forests across the country, and especially here in the eastern United States. So one concept that helps define old growth forests is seated in this idea of forest succession. So forests, when they are disturbed, will kind of reset the cycle of growth. And they start with some pioneer species at the beginning, things that will really take advantage of that sunlight. We have annual weeds in this image, and then we get into our perennial ground plants, and then we start to get pine species and saplings. And from where I am in Georgia, if you clear a lot, say in a neighborhood, and then that neighborhood doesn't get built, like many things happened in 2008, you'll blink, and by 2015, it's a young pine forest. So we're really great at making those early successional pine forests. But then given more time, those pines will dominate the canopy, and then we'll get an understory of hardwoods generally, and then those hardwoods will be able to mature and dominate that canopy. So that is a very general process, and it operates differently in different types of forest communities. But then throughout time, there's always this force of disturbance. And disturbance changes the way a forest is composed. And that disturbance could be fire, it could be insects, it could be storms like hurricanes or ice storms, and it can be human-driven like logging. And so those types of disturbance can completely reset a forest. And start all of the forest from anew. Clear-cut logging might do that. Really, really catastrophic storms can do that. They're called stand clearing. But oftentimes disturbance will happen on a patch basis. So where you might have one very large tree blow down and take the surrounding areas with it, you'll have a small patch that goes back through this process of regrowing through forest succession, having those tree species start young, grow through their lifetime, get to the end of their natural life cycle, and then return to the forest as a dead tree. But really pinning down very exact characteristics of old growth forests can be a challenge. And that's because forest communities are different across the varied aspects of our environmental conditions. And so here's just an illustration in, say, the Southern Appalachian Mountains, all of the different forest communities that you might get on one mountainside. And all of these age in different ways and have different species that are going to be that older canopy, and then creating new generations and new stands at different rates. But overall, there's these characteristics that we point to that show us old growth can start to come into play when we are allowing the natural lifespan of those trees to play out. So a tree generating, becoming a seedling and a sapling, a young tree, a mature tree, and then old growth tree. And so many people kind of point in the eastern United States to this 150-year point in time, roughly, when a forest is getting that generation of growth that is then cycling into new generations. And that oftentimes can be a good, very, very rough indicator of an older forest, is that 150-year time frame. And that really varies. We can get figures on 80 years, 200 years. In the West, we've got trees that are just getting old at 400 years. So there's a lot of complexity to it, but we want to embrace that complexity. Also, some general characteristics of older forests. The main one is big old trees. So a lot of trees species can get very large when they get very old. They're adding a new layer of growth every year with those rings. Some trees get very large very quickly. Some might stay in this kind of dwarfed bonsai form until they get that light gap and really can take off. So you can have older trees that are only about 12 inches in diameter that might live in very rough conditions, but they can be hundreds of years old. Another factor is coarse woody debris. So this is the term for all of those branches and dead matter from trees that has fallen and covers the forest floor. So you're going to have more coarse woody debris in older forests because the factor of time has allowed more of those trees to lose their limbs or die and become a snag, which is a standing dead tree, and then falling in that forest. Coarse woody debris is extremely important habitat and shows us that the nutrients from those trees are returning to the forest. Excuse me. And when you have trees that are falling and that life cycle turning over, you're going to see sometimes this pit and mound, and it's a topography of a forest floor where you'll see these pits, these dips where a tree has fallen and that root ball has lifted out of the ground, and then the mound will be that old root ball of that tree. And that topography also creates really important habitat. The fourth one is complexity. So we love to see complexity in old growth forests. And it comes in so many different directions and scales: complexity of soil, complexity of biodiversity, the canopy. So we call it horizontal complexity. We want to see life living in all of these different opportunities it can. You have horizontal complexity. Things are different across the landscape. And so that variability across a forest happens through time. And in old growth forest, time is that essential element. And then a lack of disturbance. So if you're walking through a forest of fairly similar trees and you see cut stumps, that tells you that that forest is probably a second growth one that came from logging. Or in a lot of the places in New England, you'll see these stone walls that used to line the edges of fields and farms. And that can tell you there was agricultural history. Now, that's not to say that given a couple of centuries, that forest can't regrow back into an old growth condition, but it gives you a sign of the past. And there's some really wonderful literature out there called forest forensics that give you all of these clues you can look for in a forest to understand its history. And then the last one I'll point out is trees standing the test of time. So when you're walking through a forest and you see this magnificent spreading oak, huge limbs and huge crown, and it's the perfect shape that you might see in a storybook, that might tell you that that tree had the benefit of growing up in a field to shape cattle or something like that, or on a homestead, and not necessarily in the competition of a forest. That same tree in the competition of a forest is going to be trying to get the sunlight over its neighbors. It will be growing very tall quickly, trying to get its spot in the canopy. And then in its old age, being all the way up there in the canopy, it's going to be weathering storms. And so you might see the entire top of a tree blown off, and it can regrow a new one or a new leader branch. And they often get these really interesting candelabra shapes. So when you're going through a forest, pay attention to what the tops of these older trees look like and appreciate the things that they've seen in their lifetimes. So I mentioned earlier that we do not have a lot of old growth forests on our landscape. And this is because the boom in logging that happened with colonization, with European colonization of the United States. And so this is a image that was generated in the 1920s by someone who worked at the Forest Service to understand where our virgin forest was. And this is a term that's not the same as old growth, but this means forest that has never been heavily human disturbed. So never logged, things like that. And so as we log those forests, we lose that categorization of it being virgin forest. And that I just want to note that that 1990 image was a projection from the 1926 time that this map was made. So thankfully, we do have bits of virgin forest that did survive. They aren't on this map, but it is a very good idea of the progression of how we lost these forests. So here in the East, we only have about 1% of the old growth forest that originally was on the landscape. And that is a catastrophic number. That is so little. And so there is huge potential for us to return to the historic number of old growth, acres of old growth, or percent of old growth that would be on the landscape. And people are still trying to figure out what exactly that number might be. But we definitely have very few old growth forests left. And I'm going to quickly take you through why these forests are important. So there's a couple of standout values of old growth forests that I'm going to highlight. They have many values, but these are ones that are particularly special about old growth. One of them is the impact on humans. So our physical health, our cultural significance in these forests, spiritual well-being and things like that are really heightened by old growth forests. And there's many facets to this, and then there's some really interesting research connecting these ideas. So I just want to point out two aspects of this. Shinrin-yoku is the term for forest bathing. It's the Japanese practice of tying our physical and mental well-being to time just being in a forest and interfacing with that forest. And so it's a practice that I think probably everyone could benefit from in some way, and it's growing more popular here in the United States. And to take an analytical research lens to it, which some people are doing, there's this idea that forests create these VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And so there's chemicals, essentially compounds that we're breathing that come from these trees and these plants in the forest, phytoncides. And they can lower our blood pressure, decrease our heart rate, a more healthy state when we're spending time in forests. And the older a forest is, the more time it's had to develop that complexity. And so there's beliefs that novel compounds come out of that can really promote our health. So next highlight is species diversity and abundance. So one study in some eastern hemlock forests showed us that the ground cover of herbaceous and shrub layer in a forest, there's 4 times greater ground cover of these species in old growth forests than second growth forests. That same study showed that 29 of 47 total ground layer plants across these 2 forests were only found in the old growth areas. So there's a lot of plants and lichen and bacteria and wildlife that depend on the special habitats and microhabitats that are created when forests are left to grow complex and old over time. And so in this one particular image that I showed you, you have moss growing on a dead tree, you have fungi growing on a dead tree, you have ferns benefiting from the cooler and the more moist microclimate created by the side of a dead tree. So I love the saying, there's often more life in a dead tree than a living one. And here's some highlights of old growth associated species, some wildlife that you might find in Michigan. And one of them in particular is the northern goshawk. So these are found in greater abundance in old growth forests, and they prefer these conditions. So there's something about these large dead trees and these complex canopies that really benefits them. And here's a list of many other species that really depend on these environments. And so it can take us hundreds of years, multiple generations to be able to restore these characteristics to a forest. And many of these species can't really thrive until those things are met. So we lose a lot when we lose our old growth forests. And then I'm briefly going to highlight the carbon storage capacity of older forests. So one particular graph here, forest carbon index, kind of demonstrates the capacity to store carbon in a forest, and it grows as a forest ages. And that's because those trees are getting larger. Every year they're capturing carbon. You get a new ring of growth on that tree, a slightly larger canopy, more leaves. But in addition to that, you're increasing the amount of carbon that gets stored in the soil of those forests. So they store a really significant amount of carbon. Up to 50% of it is actually below ground. And we're learning a lot more about the capacity and how we can continue to protect those forest soils and the carbon they store and how they become vulnerable. And then though some of the carbon of a forest is stored in wood products, and it'll be captured and tucked away in that wood product for the lifetime of the wood product until it decomposes or is burned, or otherwise that carbon returns to the atmosphere. A large amount of carbon is additionally lost when we're actually logging those wood products. And so we have to consider that 5 times higher. That's how much more carbon is lost in timber harvesting than other types of disturbance. And you can see this from a study here in 2016 that looked at 2006 to 2010, how we were losing carbon from forests. And that's because, and you can see this logging image here, a lot is left behind to more rapidly decompose. Those soils are disturbed when roads are built and things like that. So carbon is a really important aspect of forests, and our older forests are storing carbon. So there's really important amounts of carbon. There's this term called proforestation, and it's a natural climate solution that says we need to keep our intact mature forests standing because of the carbon that they hold. It's also important to plant trees and grow forests, but keeping our older ones should also be a priority. So all of those values are things that we are trying to promote and protect through the Old Growth Forest Network. And so now I'll briefly tell you about our organization and the work that we do. This is what you will see if you go onto our website, which is oldgrowthforest.net. We are an organization, a 501c3 that started in 2011. Our headquarters are in Maryland, but our staff is spread around the country. We work wherever forests grow. Our mission is to create this national network of protected old growth forests. So we work on a county by county basis to try and identify an older forest, or where they still remain an old growth forest for that county that is protected and publicly accessible. We're trying to get people into these forests, give them time to, forest bathe or learn about the complexity of them, or just enjoy how beautiful they are. And so we have a generations long mission. We're working across all of these counties of the country to grow this network. We also, as you can see today, we give lectures and talks about old growth forests, the science around them, our ties to health and well-being, how we can best protect these forests. So education is an aspect of our mission. And we also work when there's special threatened forests, trying to find solutions to get those forests protected. So I mentioned every county that can grow forests is where we work, and it is a large mission. So about 2/3 of the country can grow forest. And so those are the counties that we work in. 2,370 counties are ones that we've identified as able to grow significant forest ecosystems. So that's where we're working. And then these are the states where we currently have at least one forest in the old growth forest network. We hope that this will one day be all 50 states, and hopefully Puerto Rico as well. But we work to add new states to the network, and Minnesota will be very soon on this map, as Nick will be there in the coming days to celebrate old growth forests being added there. And here's actual pins of where all of our forests are. So we're at about 220 forests, and you can see that there's a concentration here kind of in the mid-Atlantic region. And that's just by nature of where our organization started and where we started making connections with people in their local forests and forest managers. But we are definitely interested in growing wherever forests grow. And we've got staff members in different regions connecting with local forest owners and researching their local forests and trying to find old growth forests that may have flown under the radar to this point, but we want to make sure that they don't get lost for that same reason. And I'll give you a little bit of introduction into what qualifies a forest to be inducted into the old growth forest network. We have 3 major criteria. One of them is for the forest to be an old growth or mature second growth forest. So generally, we are looking for the oldest forest in the county to protect. And this is our best measure to get older forests, continue to have our oldest forests remain on the landscape while we're catching up on the many lost old growth forests elsewhere. Oftentimes, we will train our volunteers, we call them county coordinators, to help us find the best forest in their county to be added to the network. And we train them on the many visual characteristics that I mentioned earlier, how to find a history, the land history of an area to understand how old a forest is. And then sometimes we have researchers and scientists involved to get that hard data on a forest age, which is very helpful as well. We want them to allow public access as well. So we want these forests to be open to the public to some degree. And half of our mission is people. So we want to see people enjoying these forests, learning and benefiting from them. And then the most important criteria is that they're protected from commercial logging. So we want to make sure that that forest will persist and it's not going to be lost to maybe a budget cut, that someone looks and sees the timber value of a forest that is very old and we lose it just for that fact. So we require that aspect of forest to be added to the network. Sometimes those protections already exist, but sometimes we have to sit down and add them, or work with an agency to put them into place, or work with a community to advocate for that forest to be protected. Our protections range from, in our publicly owned forests, they could be federal, state, county level protections, county conservation parks. But then we have other categories that apply more so when we might have privately owned forests that are still open to the public, where we're looking at a forest management plan or an organization mission, conservation easements that specify no logging, deed restrictions, or sometimes we'll do an additional memorandum of agreement to specify that commercial logging. So we just want to make sure that there's something in place there to allow that forest to continue standing. And I just want to show this figure of land ownership with our forest age. And so these are public agencies and then private ownership. And you can see private ownership and private forest ownership is much, much larger across the country. And so there's important steps that need to be taken to make sure our older forests on private land are being cared for and that we're increasing that amount of old growth forest. So old growth forest is also fairly small compared to the other categories from this study. So we have much room to grow, and our mature forests are best suited to grow into the next generation's old growth where appropriate. Okay, and that is the last that you'll hear from me, and I will let Nick continue to talk to you about forests and forests specific to Michigan.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm Nick Sanchez. I'm the network manager with the Old Growth Forest Network. I can't see all of you, but some of you I may have heard of or have met in the past. I'm a native Michigander and have worked for a couple different conservation organizations in the past, and so we may have crossed paths. But I'm now with the Old Growth Forest Network, and I would love to dive into to talk specifically about our forests in Michigan. Next slide, please. And so, really quick, kind of running over who owns our forests in Michigan. So this is some data pulled from the National Woodland Owners Survey. You can see that about 62% of our forests, of our 20 million acres of forest land approximately, is in private hands, 38% public, and a very small percentage of tribal land, and just kind of get a feel for kind of that distribution across our forest land. The average age of the private landowners managing those forests is about 64 years old. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show this graph. It was kind of interesting. In places like our Forest Action Plan in Michigan, for example, we kind of hear this language around our increasing area of old forests. And I think that is somewhat of a myth. And this graph from the Forest Service, the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, kind of demonstrates that at least by some of the estimates, some of the metrics out there can kind of give us a little bit of a picture of the age of our forests and kind of the conditions. And so pointing out really quick that in 1980, by the estimates done in the FIA plots, we had more forests that were over 100 years old than we have now. Next slide, please. And so kind of expanding upon that, the age classes, here's kind of a distribution across Michigan. You can kind of really see that what we have most of course, is forests between that 61 and 80 years old, which is kind of funny because that average age is around 65, which is the age of that average landowner, which is kind of funny because our forests can obviously grow much older than we can. You can see that once you get up to 121 plus years old, that really rapidly declines. At 121 to 140, it's something like around 1%, and then really declining really quickly. While we don't have a clear picture of what the landscape would have looked like prior to European colonization, we know that by the estimations of return intervals on fire and on wind and other disturbances, that this graph would have looked much differently. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of our network forests that we've recognized so far in Michigan. And so we've got 12 forests out of our, I think there, if I remember correctly, 83 counties in Michigan. We've got about 12 places that have been identified. So running through those really quick, some of these might be familiar to you. Newton's Woods within the Fred Rust Forest that's owned by Michigan State down in Cass County, as well as Baker Woodlot on Michigan State University's campus. We were fortunate enough to celebrate with the forestry department there last weekend and a great walk through Baker Woodlot. Next slide, please. We also added Estevant Pines with the Michigan Nature Association earlier this year up in the Keweenaw Peninsula. And then Odin Island up in Emmett County, owned by the Little Traverse Conservancy last fall. Next slide, please. Witherell Woods and Palmer Park down in Wayne County earlier this spring, as well as Amon Park in Ottawa County, just west of Grand Rapids. Those came into the network this spring as well. Next slide, please. And then Nordhaus Dunes Wilderness Area in Mason County, and then just to the south of there, Otto Nature Preserve, which is managed by the Oceana Conservation District there in Oceana County. Next slide, please. And then later this summer, we added Flower Creek Dunes in Muskegon County, and then we've had Hartwick Pines, the state-owned, well-known old-growth forest in Crawford County in the network for a little, I think since 2013. Next slide, please. And then last Sunday, we added Duncan Woods in Ottawa County, a second forest in Ottawa County. Those two forests, Amon Park and Duncan Woods, are really quite different and kind of highlight different ecosystems. And then we have Sandpoint in Huron County, Michigan as well. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to kind of also talk about how some of these places are maybe kind of hiding in plain sight. And so this doesn't look like much unless you're really into beautiful fall scenery, which I think we all are. But this forest behind here, next slide, please, contains a beautiful old growth forest. And so last year we had a great connection from Mike Small-again, who I think I saw as one of our participants here, and Keith Martell, a consulting forester in Northern Michigan, got a call about an old forest in Tuscola County owned by the airport there, where some folks had come through and offered to cut some of those beautiful trees down. And so we had a chance to kind of go out and get a look at this place. And I was absolutely blown away. This is really kind of a lost old growth forest, something that to our knowledge, has not been documented anywhere in kind of the remaining chunks of old growth left in Michigan. This site, the old growth portion, is probably about 40 acres or something similar to that. Several, you're just walking through a forest full of trees that are 30 plus inches in diameter. You can see Keith Martell there with the diameter tape around a giant American beech there, and some sugar maple there on the left-hand side of the screen. Next slide, please. So kind of going through some of those potential old growth indicators, things that you might be able to keep an eye out for while you're out in the landscape. Pointing out that really weathered top, which Sarah mentioned earlier, is kind of an indicator of an older forest. You have this taller trees that have been up in the canopy for some time. You can see the really kind of antler-like horizontal branches up in that tree. And while you can't see it in this photo there, those were also moss covered. And so holding water and creating kind of a different environment up there too. Down further below, the second hand there shows an old branch scar where some kind of weedy herbaceous plant got started within that old branch scar. And so that's been broken off and decayed long enough for a soil to kind of form in that scar. And so you have this kind of, those complex habitats that are kind of building upon themselves. To the right, a very old sugar maple with a very shaggy bark and hollowed out, obviously some different habitat that's being created there as well. Next slide, please. Kind of going a little further with those indicators, you've got trees that are kind of reaching for that sunlight, that spot where an old tree may have fallen in the past, and so the tree is kind of snaking its way over in that direction. We've got old hemlocks that have had the top blown off and are starting to decay, a great snag there. Something like a hemlock, which has gotten up to quite a large size there, takes a long time for that to happen. Takes a long time for that tree to mature to the point where it's starting to fall apart and decay. And so these are some of those old growth conditions. This is part of this forest, as I mentioned, was marked for a timber sale, and you can see the quite unhappy or maybe neutral face that they were drawing on these forests. Maybe not intentionally, but it caught my eye. Anyway, these places are potentially out there while you are surveying properties with landowners, or getting or potentially your organization has picked up a new property. It was recently donated. These features, while there may not be, we know that there's very little old growth left on the landscape. It's important that we do keep our eye out for these places where they do exist, and kind of looking for those patches, however small they might be, and treating them differently. Next slide, please. I've been having a lot of fun getting into, looking really closely at some of these older trees and seeing what we can see. Sarah was mentioning some of the indicators that you might be able to find in an old growth forest. And these are a couple I had an incredible opportunity to see earlier this year within Michigan. You can see the shingle moss there on the left, the wall scalewort, which is a liverwort. They kind of give me the shivers when you find something like this. A year ago, I wouldn't have known to even look for these things. And so when you kind of get a chance to find these things, it's really kind of incredible. And then the tree lungwort, like up in McCormick Wilderness. So these are just some of those indicators that you might find in certain forest types, different mosses and lichens that require older forests to survive. And so these are fascinating places with incredible biodiversity. Next slide, please. And then, so I just wanted to kind of, wrap up maybe with some kind of open questions for our conservation community to kind of think about and think about our messaging and our priorities as we get close to 2024, and we're thinking about our priorities for the future here. Thinking about where we might kind of place this in the context of those priorities. And so I'll just kind of read through these questions. Are Michigan's forests really getting older? That's something that you kind of hear and read quite a bit. And I would encourage us to back that up with data. Are they really getting older? From some of the metrics that we're able to pick up within FIA and maybe other ways of surveying the landscape and knowing what's out there. Is that actually true? Or are we kind of getting to this point of where you have a big bubble in that 60 to 80 years old, but that bubble kind of more or less bursts as those forests get older for one reason or another. Those older forests are not making it into an old growth stage by any means. Sarah mentioned that 150-year point, as we could kind of consider that maybe a target for moving some of those forests along that continuum towards that age. And older, we'd love to see older. Are we adequately considering old growth representation in our forest restoration goals across all forest types? We know that old growth is not just for the maple hemlock forest. There are old growth red pine, old growth oak forest. And so are we, while we're considering, all the things, and I know this group, the Stewardship Network, is really focused on things like biodiversity and restoration. Are we considering that age component within that restoration work? Another question: do protection measures like conservation easements go far enough in ensuring necessary ecological continuity in decision making over the long term? And what I mean by that is on our conservation easements, which are a critical way of protecting forests, are we making sure that areas on those conservation easements that are maybe identified as an older part of the forest are being protected as our staff changes over in our conservancies, as landowners change over on the land? Do we know that there's continuity in kind of the in the progression of those or the continuance of those older parts of the forest that really are rare in the landscape? Are we including old forests or potential for future old growth in our field surveys? And are private landowners with old forests made aware of their rarity and the benefits of those forests, and are options given for restoring those old forests? And so thinking about just kind of posing those questions and as a community and thinking about those things moving forward. Next slide, please. And so here's kind of our closing point. You can kind of interact with us. We of course we cooperate and partner with agencies and organizations from the federal government down to local community level and nonprofits. And so if you've got forest land, if you're interested in old forests, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear what you have in your within your ownership or the forest that you're managing, and so please get in touch with us. You can explore locations on our website, places that have been added to the network. You can nominate old forests there. We get a lot of nominations from the public and experts about where these places are in the landscape and how to find them. You can volunteer with us, of course, if you are interested and interested in being one of those volunteer county coordinators. We really rely on local expertise and people exploring their local forests. We're a pretty lean organization, and we're definitely not able to visit all of these nominated forests, and so we really rely on people knowing their local forests or having an interest in getting to know those places. You can, of course, sign up as a supporter to get invitations to our exciting upcoming events that happen fairly regularly and are pretty. We have quite a few happening in the spring and fall, as those are the kind of the big months for getting out for a community hike. And so, with that, I think that we're ready to open it up to questions.
That is excellent. Thank you so very much for the presentation. We've had a lot of great comments coming in the chat and also some good questions in the Q&A. So I encourage all of our attendees to please keep sharing those. One that I've seen come up a few times that I wanted to ask, and forgive me if you've already answered this, but is there a specific size requirement for the woodland for your network, and anything else related to that question?
So I can take that one. We do not have a minimum acreage. Of course, larger is better from an ecological standpoint and from probably the visitor experience as well. And so, but we're taking all of these forests within the context of the county in which they exist. And so, what's a small forest in Wayne County might be quite different than a small forest up in Baraga. And so yeah, we've got these kind of they're pretty like an ideal kind of situation We don't have a lot of hard, fast rules around the size and age and so on.
And we work in urban areas too. And so with that, we still have to consider some counties have as little as 6% of their area covered by canopy. And so we're still going to look to honor the forests that are there and connect people to them. So that's why we work on a county by county basis, and it all depends on the context there.
I appreciate that. And I will say I was surprised to see Palmer Park in Detroit on there. I'm excited to go visit it. I have been to Palmer Park and I live in Detroit, but I was not aware that it was a part of the Old Growth Forest Network. So that's really exciting. Excellent. So then let me revisit the Q&A here. So a question from Mike Smulligan about the fact that 62% of Michigan forests are privately owned. Wondering what efforts you all are making to increase recognition of old growth forest on private lands, or perhaps the ways in which those lands are held. I know one of your criteria was that the land is publicly accessible. And so just curious how you kind of approach the aspect of old growth forest being on private land.
I'll start by saying just because it's not open to the public doesn't mean we don't want to engage with you. So we have another program. It's not our flagship program, but is specific to privately owned forests that are not open to the public. And we call it our Private Forest Registry. And so this is for woodland owners who are interested in protecting their old growth forests or cultivating old growth forests in their woodlands. And so we really recommend that they reach out to us. You can get your forest nominated for our private forest recognition as well.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and I will, that was only half the question. So let me address what Mike was asking as well. We also like to work directly with landowners to promote things like forever wild conservation easements on parts of their properties, or working within their own management plans to recognize old growth areas, finding the right place in that management plan to cultivate those forests, to steward those older forests, looking at maybe setting a small part aside to become old growth. And so there's options out there for private landowners too, when you don't have some of these policies, these public policies that we were talking about that make them eligible for the Old Growth Forest Network.
It's excellent. Thank you so much. So another question that came up related to the management of different forests and potential old growth forest areas. Thinking about the concept of logging and other types of management. So there was mention of research at the University of Vermont suggesting that active management can achieve desired old growth conditions faster than doing nothing. And so curious about how your organization approaches active management of old growth forests and whether or not that involves any sort of logging or timber harvesting. So yeah, just a general question about your approach to that specific scenario.
Sure. I'll say one thing, Nick, if you want to add more to it, feel free. Yeah, we recognize that there's really interesting research being done to see what role people can play in restoring old growth conditions on a landscape. I would say the Old Growth Forest Network is taking an extremely long time scale look at how we restore these forests, and we just let time do what it's going to do in these forests generally without needing to put in the input. A lot of times nature can take care of these things itself. Obviously, when there's certain species that rely on some of these old growth conditions, you may want to elevate their needs in your management of a forest in your old growth conditions. But looking broadly at old growth, it's something that is a really great recipe of time and the forces of nature. And there's certain circumstances where we don't have to do anything for that to happen. And so we're going to recognize that as well.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I would say that, I think that, that as I mentioned, a lot of times you get this kind of illusion that our forests are just aging and aging, and that we're kind of getting this old growth by default? And I think that really the answer is both. And while we're engaged in the passive side of things, we may also need others to step up on other parts of the forest to do some active management towards those older growth features as well. For the network, we're interested in that passive approach. And they, as Sarah mentioned, there are things they're not quite the same. You might get tree sizes and the coarse woody debris and such in that short period of time, but you're not going to get those features that really take time to develop. An example of that would be something like elevated root structures, where you have trees growing on nurse logs, where eventually that nurse log decays and you have that stilt tree left. You can't speed that process along, and that's one example, and an important habitat feature within these forests as well. And so yeah, I think both is an answer, and a lot more of both.
That's excellent. Thank you. And as we are starting to get close to our time and we have our short TSN intro, I have one last question for both of you. Do you have a favorite old growth forest that you have come into contact with, either through your network work or maybe a place that you had visited personally? Maybe just highlighting some of your favorite examples of old growth forests.
Sorry, I need more time to think. Do you have?
Okay, well, I've got an answer. I would say the Olympic National Park is my favorite. It's a spectacular place. That's what you're looking at. I think I still have this slide up here with our information. That's within the Olympic National Park. Fantastic place. It just feels otherworldly.
Yeah, I would say, for if I could just kind of plug into the Michigan theme, Fred Rust Forest, Newton's Woods there. I got a chance to visit that in summertime, and it's really an incredible place. There's also incredible old growth in the UP, of course, too, and completely different forests. And so we're of course we're blessed with that complexity and different forest types here in Michigan to go check out. Another favorite is near Marquette in the Presque Isle or Presque Isle. I'm not. I always forget which one they say. Unit of the Gwen State Forest there. Beautiful, beautiful old growth forest within that area too.
We want to know about other people's favorites, so please go check out our map, see if your favorite is currently represented there, and if it's not, please nominate it to our organization so we can start looking into adding it to the Old Growth Forest Network.
That is excellent. And actually, Kathy, it looks like mentioned that there's an old forest state natural area adjacent to Overton Park in Memphis that she didn't see on the map. So Kathy suggests that you nominate it via the process. That would be excellent. Well, thank you both so much again. Really, really appreciate it. We got some great engagement in the chat, and it sounds like people really appreciate the presentation. So with that, I will take us into a little bit of our outro slides for the Stewardship Network. There we are. And so once again, wanted to remind folks about our annual conference coming up January 29th and 30th of next year. You can find more information at stewardshipnetwork.org/conference. And we recommend that you become a regular with our webcast. Register for upcoming webcast episodes that you're interested in. They're always on the second Wednesday of the month at the Eastern Time Zone's noon hour, and we'll send an email reminder on the morning of. So we're excited next month to welcome Jillian Farkas with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and presenting on the Great Lakes piping plover and the road to recovery. And next in December, we have Abigail J. Lynch with the USGS National Climate Adaptation Science Center with Radical Ecosystem Change, applying the RAD Resist, Accept, Direct framework. And then in January of 2024, we have Jesse Lincoln with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and with the presentation Identifying Recoverable Fire-Dependent Systems in the Huron-Manistee National Forest. So finally, once again, thank you all so much for being a part of the presentation. Thank you to Nick and to Sarah for presenting for us, and we hope to see you all next month.